Hey guys, Mr. Star here. I personally think by the time this video goes up, it will be in the middle of my flight to the US. So enjoy Mr. Background Noise as I'm gonna be talking to you guys from the future, which is gonna be the past of today, right? So for today's video, I want to sort of do this little exercise together with chat as well as players of the HSR community on what would you have pulled for in each version as of this current day. So the best way I can think about it, right, is that imagine if you're playing HSR as like a Pokemon game, right? So you don't actually instantly jump straight into the Elite Four, right? You don't instantly jump into the level 80 gym battles where you can instantly farm like level 80, level 90 Pokemons, wild Pokemons, right? If you were to start out HSR as a Pokemon game, you have to start from 1.0. So every single banner in HSR based on their chronological order will roll throughout the entire time. So from there on, what units would you actually decide to pull for each respective versions, right? So in order to do this exercise with chat, there is a little bit of context to first establish, which I honestly was pretty shocked after discovering for myself, because apparently for Honkai God Rail, you are able to get on average 105 premium summons per version. On average, the biggest spike being on launch, having the 213 push in 1.0, but this is definitely because of a lot of one-time clear achievements, assuming you actually cleared all of them, right? Then as the later version is gonna progress, I would say on average, if you were to start from 1.0 all the way through now, having a 100 pulls per version is not going to be too unrealistic with Honkai God Rail, right? And of course, this is going to take into account your permanent as well as your weekly modes, if you actually can clear the weekly modes, right? Then we also have this event warps from your end game content, right? This is your end game content. I'm guessing this is from your end game content, so recurring per version, it is gonna be roughly 7.7, with a number going up slightly higher due to the current inclusion of a Starward mode. So with that being established, the personal rule I'm gonna give for this particular exercise is that it is not a cost thing, because some people can get a unit in the first 10 pull, maybe even an E1, whereas some people have to go for 160, 170, or even 180 pulls for a single unit, right? But if I were to play HSR, not as a gacha game, but just purely from a resource management perspective, on average, I would just give a single 5-star equivalent to 100 pulls. That's it, right? Just to keep things very, very simplistic. Then for the light cones, technically speaking, it is slightly lower, or rather, you wouldn't spend on average 100 pulls, assuming you have 75-25 as well as a 10 pulls early. But I will still count this as 100 pulls on average, right? Just for the sake of consistency. So this is gonna be 100 pulls for one 5-star limited, 100 pulls for one 5-star limited. All right, then from all this, we are going to construct our teams as if we play HSR as not a gacha game, but a Pokemon extension kind of thing, right? So with that being said, right, these are all my personal subjective opinions. It is not an opinion based on meta chasing and what would be the best pooling decision of every single version. Because at the end of the day, if you play a gacha game, I akin to those units that you pull in gacha games. Like if you were a kid, right? Or if you were like you want to buy something from the toy store, right? You would just buy a toy that you enjoy, even if that toy doesn't have as much popularity or meta relevance. And as an example, right? If I was a kid last time, and there's like I have a lot of Transformers. Right, I have a lot of Gundams, right? Maybe the main push for a Gundam is like a Freedom Gundam. And then if you were to pull Justice, is like Artron Zala's Gundam. It is not the main push, because Freedom is the main push. But I will probably still get Justice, just because I like Justice Gundam, right? So with that being said, the very first thing that I am gonna be going for, as just based on the free-to-play pools, and that is going to be Scylla, right? Our very first cost investments, even from all the way back in version 1.0. The reason is very simple. Scylla's role back then, it was not really designed, at least for me as a player, to last for the rest of my life. Because if you have been playing gacha games long enough, every, or rather most DPS, especially a 1.0 DPS, they are gonna get power crept by newer DPS. But still, I would choose to get myself this E0S0 Scylla based on the information I have now, because it would make my early game experience very, very manageable, especially back then when Scylla could actually kill minions. Imagine using Scylla back then compared to Scylla nowadays before her Nova Flare. You would have never utilized Scylla's resurgence, at least to that degree of success anymore, right? So based on the fun factor, right, the early to mid game experience, as well as the fact that I just refused to use, like, we didn't have shit like Archer back then, right? There was no such thing as a free Archer, free DHPD, free RMC. We only had 4 stars, like Win Dante. So for one cost, especially with the abnormal amount of pools that you get from 1.0, I would then invest in E0S0 Scylla, skipping her light cone while equipping her with the cruising in the Stellar Sea. That is gonna be our very first pool. Am I gonna be pulling for Jingyuan? The answer is absolutely fucking not, because I do not actually need a second DPS. Alright, if I were to think about getting myself a second DPS, I don't even think my account would actually get to the degree of investments to tackle the 2-team Memory of Chaos that early anyways, because I'm still trying to clear out the story, the SU, and just dabbling myself around the HSR universe. So whether or not I want this 1.0 second DPS is purely if I really want to push for that second team. And from what I see right here, whether you get yourself 3 stars or not get yourself 3 stars, the difference in pools is just not worth it for me as a player. So because I'm not going to be chasing the 3-star endgame content purely just as a player, not as a content creator, I will just completely skip Jingyuan and still stick with my E0S0 Scylla. Right, so that's going to be 1.0. 1.1 is going to see the introduction of Silver Wolf as well as Luocha. Would I pull myself one copy of E0S0 Silver Wolf back then, before the Nova Flare? Personally, I would say yes. Because at this point of time in HSR 1.1, weakness was still very much a important thing before we understood the concept of brute forcing, right? Toughness bar, implanting quantum, and we didn't really have an idea of like what was a flagship, right? There was no such thing as a flagship because everything could work simultaneously, since team building at the start of HSR is very broad. Right, you can kind of just mix and match things, and Silver Wolf with that Witness implant will allow me to expand my team building with what I had back then, like my 4-star DPSs if I wanted to, right? So I would get myself a copy of E0S0 Silver Wolf, as well as using S5 Tutorial, which is an absolutely absurd light code. Also, shout out to Incessant Rain, which is Silver Wolf's S1. If the day ever comes where Dawei will give Nova Flares to a light cone, I really hope Incessant Rain gets like 180% degree change of what a light cone is actually supposed to do, right? So that is gonna be that. For Luocha, this is the first question that I will probably ponder a little bit more. Like, it's not as easy of a decision whether I want to get Luocha. But I think if I were to think back on my playing experiences, if I did not have a Bailu, because we didn't have Gallagher, right? The only thing we had back then was Fire MC, Ice March 7th, Japart, Bailu. Okay, and I guess Natasha, right? So if I didn't have Bailu, and I still have to rely on teams like Fire MC and Ice March 7th to get me through, I would have considered pulling for Luocha. So unironically, right, out of every single beginner standard units, if there was actually a standard unit I can choose, I would have legitimately picked up Bailu over Bronya. But obviously, you can't actually choose this because the selector wasn't a thing. You only get a selector at like 300 pulls. So very, very early on, your first 50 pulls, it is purely RNG. But I feel like Bailu's value right here allowed me to skip that one cost on Luocha just to give me a little bit more comfort, especially if I want to go through from the earlier levels of Simulated Universe, as well as Memory of Chaos. Not Memory of Chaos, but like Forgotten Hall, or even like the Elites in the open world, right? So this will kind of depend on the situation. Ideally, I don't get Luocha. So that's pretty much it, right? Then the next unit for version 1.2 is going to be Blade as well as Kafka, right? So this is once again my personal list on what units I will pull for, right? It is not like the best meta or whatever, but I will skip both. And the reason is also very simple. I just don't really like DOT, the way DOT plays in most gacha games. I have never really been a DOT player. While I'm absolutely sure if you were a DOT main, Kafka is definitely a pull here, right? If you love the entire concept of stacking DOTs and letting it explode, this is definitely a pull. But I just personally don't really like playing DOT. Even till this day, on both my main as well as free play account, I have not picked up DOT, and it is just purely a personal preference, right? Then for Blade over here, I still would not go ahead and pull him. And the main reason is really just because I look at HSR as a game, not like League of Legends. Because if this was League of Legends, and you actually had the utility for a full-on bruiser top laner who wants to both sustain himself as well as dealing a decent amount of damage, I might consider Blade. But because HSR is not like, okay, like Wuwa or like Zenless Zone 0, right? Where those mechanical skills, where you can like heal, perfect dodge and everything, Blade could have been a really good like one-man army of like managing your parries and dodge while he self-sustains. But because HSR as a game is not really based around that, it is still based on like building your DPS to support and sustains, I would legitimately skip the entirety of version 1.2 and see what's gonna be happening right after it, right? So that is gonna be that. And now this is where I would say, personally speaking, I would be very, very inclined to pull for Mr. Dale. Right, this is gonna be our first big boy investment in version 1.3. As a matter of fact, I would have most likely put for a signature weapon as well way back then, making this our first ever E0S1 unit. So where the hell is Buckle's Lycone? There it is. So this is gonna be our very, very first 2-cost unit, personally speaking. And if I were to look at it from the lens of like the entirety of like the 1,000 summons, right? Of like every single version you get 100 pulls on average, I would have front loaded the pulls behind just to get E2S1 Dale. Because he really was like so satisfying to play. I have used E2S1 Dale since day one, and like even nowadays whenever we do like our anomaly arbitration contest or like we do like the different endgame, I still use E2 Dale, and so far he has cleared Anomaly King with the respective wheelchair supports for roughly a 4 to 5 cycle, which I think is honestly really crazy considering he has not gotten a Noah Flare ever, the closest thing being the Sparkles Noah Flare, right? So I would have gotten myself my E0S1 Dale, and also another reason why I would have gotten this is because this is around a ballpark where I want to build my second team, because I have only been sticking to a single E0S0 5-star from 1.0 all the way through 1.2, so 3 versions, or rather 3 patches later, I think as the second DPS for version 1, this would make quite a bit of sense to me, right? And at the very same time, I would have also picked up a E0S0 Fusion, because I think E0S0 Fusion way back in those days, her sustain was pretty much the most comfortable I would have ever seen from the entirety of version 1, to a certain extent even remaining relatively stable in version 2, right? Especially as you. She was really satisfying as you, if you want to consider getting herself the just don't get the regression, like the split from destruction, where you were like split the damage, then that was really bad. But generally speaking, I just really like the way that Fusion was able to sustain my team back then, and I skipped out Luocha back then, and I'm tired of using Bailu or Japart or like Ice March 7, and there was no Gallagher, so I would have gotten myself an E0S0 Fusion. The Lycone, I would have probably given her the day 1 of my life, which is the 4-star March Lycone, or maybe even Texture of Memories, but I did invest S5 Cruising and Stellar Sea for Scylla, which is also another reason why I'm getting this S1 for Dale, because not just that we missed out on Aeon since we went for Cruising, but also energy regeneration for Dale was gonna be really good back then, right? So that is gonna be our next 3 cost in version 1.3. Then for the next version, which is gonna be 1.4, Jingliu as well as Topaz. For this particular DPS, I personally think back then, if you skipped Dale, back in 1.3, I would have gotten Jingliu. Because Jingliu was a very, very beginner-friendly DPS, especially at the start of version 1, because most players' gears were dog shit. Right, the 50% crit rate allowed a lot of casuals to stack on their crit damage and make a very serviceable DPS, even if they don't have the best relic qualities, which is pretty much most players, especially the free-to-plays at the start of HSR back then. So if I skip this, I would have gone Jingliu. But because I already got myself an E0 as one deal, and I am still using my E0 as Scylla with Silverwolf, I would have most likely just skipped this because we are gonna be nearing the end of version 1 anyways, right? So that's gonna be my personal decision making there. Then Topaz, I'ma keep it a buck. I feel that her role, right? Her banner placement, her unit, like what she actually does as a unit, just never really found an actual footing since her launch. Because if you want to say Topaz could act as a dual DPS back then, yeah, maybe, right? You could use like Topaz as a dual DPS with Kelala, right? People were literally running with Kelala because of follow-up attack. But like, we didn't have a thing like Fei Xiao back then. We didn't have a thing like Babin back then. There was no such thing as a team-wide support. Because Rame didn't even come out yet. So if I were to get this Topaz, there is literally no use for her in any of my teams. For my Scylla, I could stick with my Tingyun. I could stick with my Silverwolf. For my Dill, honestly, if Topaz didn't consume that many skill points, maybe as a sub DPS, right? If they made it such that whenever you cast your skill on Nambi, she consumes 0 skill points, maybe. But because she was also just really skill point hungry, and the amount of utility she provided was only for follow-up attacks, which none of my main DPS is going to be doing, I wouldn't put Topaz in this version. Then going forward in the future, I'll explain whether I will pull. But as of right now, this value for 1.5, or rather 1.4, was just not good for me, considering I did just spend 3 costs for E0 as one deal, as well as E0 as your fusion, right? So that is gonna be that. Then moving on to 1.5, featuring the first ever banner of Huo and Argenti. I'ma keep it a buck, I would have gone this. I would have gotten 1 copy of E0 as your Huo. Mainly just because the lack of Gallagher back in version 1 is quite annoying. Because Ice March 7 and Fire MC was just like really rough as a sustain. So if my account did not have either Japart or Bailu, I would have not been having a very good time for my team too. And even if I did have Japart or Bailu, Hue's cleanse when she came out was second to none. And this is also around the time where we are gonna be facing enemies like Olumatron. Because Olumatron had the fucking Imprison, and that was like super fucking annoying, where people literally had to use Ice March 7 to apply a shield and dispel the you know what I'm saying? So I would have gotten myself an E0 as your Hue, and frankly speaking, the energy regeneration, the attack buff would have worked quite well with both my attack scaling DPS either being Scylla as well as Dale, because their use on the ultimate is also pretty good back then, right? So I would get myself this 1 copy of Hue and one last unit before we get into version 1, or rather version 2, and that is gonna be Runmei. I think everybody that played HSR back in version 1.6, you probably would have picked up Runmei because she was our first ever rate up limited harmony unit, right? And she brought us weakness break efficiency, damage buff, rest pen, toughness, the toughness delayed by the extension. So I think just purely because it was the first ever harmony, whether or not you actually see Runmei being homeless in 2, 3, or even 4, it didn't really matter, because what we had back then, she was definitively speaking best in slot, right? You could literally slap her onto any of your main DPS and it would drastically improve your performance. Also, we didn't really have enough options as a 4-star harmony support as well, because you essentially had units like Yukong, right? You had Yukong, which you could use with Dale, right, for a little bit, right? You have your Tingyun. If you didn't have Bronya, then this gives Runmei's value even higher. So just because of the amount of versatility she offered in version 1, I would have decided to get a copy of this, which brings our total cost in version 1 6 plus 1 for a 7 cost expenditure, right? Maybe, you know what, just to be a little bit fair, I would have most likely gotten myself the S1 Runmei as well, because the +1 skill point, as well as the energy regeneration per wave, from back then in version 1, I would have seen the value of this for both of my team comps, and I would have likely invested that 1 cost just to make this a little bit more rounded, considering she was the first ever Harmony support, right? So that will mark the end of my personal V1 team at the end of 8 costs, right? 8 costs in the entirety of version 1, or rather roughly 800 pulls, if I equate one single limited unit to 100 pulls on average, right? So with that being established, we're then gonna be going on into version 2. Now, before we get into version 2, number 1, smash that like and subscribe button, thank you very much. Number 2, I do want to say that out of all of the versions we have right now, which is 1.0 all the way through to 4.3, which is not really full just yet, we have a grand total of 2,800. This is 2,800, right? Because it's 28 different versions. For a grand total, personally, from my list, it's gonna be 28 choices of 5 stars on average. Once again, it is not meant to be like 1-to-1. This is only a hypothetical situation where if you're able to get a single unit for 100 pulls guaranteed for both you and Lycone, I will just use that as an equation to make our planning a little bit more straightforward, theoretically speaking, of course, right? So now with that being established, we essentially spent, 8 costs in version 1, meaning we are gonna be left with, I believe, 20 costs all the way up into version 4, right? So starting off with version 2, this is gonna be the very first Black Swan as well as Sparkle banner. Now, obviously, I'm not gonna be putting for Black Swan because I skipped DOT as a whole. We already have ourselves Dale, we already have ourselves Scylla, and Sparkle is a very, very easy 1 cost upgrade, or rather 100 pulls upgrade, because it will instantly make my Dale so much stronger, that even if I didn't really see the value of the skill point increase of Sparkle as a general support, the hyper carry nature of either Dale or even Scylla would have given me the additional option of pulling for Sparkle. Not to mention she was our second limited harmony back then, right? So I would have definitely gotten this 1 more cost, first ever cost in version 2, and then this will bring us into, I would say, this period in the entire list of HSR's creation was probably the highest amount of time you would have felt FOMO as a free-to-play player, because we are gonna be getting the anniversary DPS, the anniversary sustain, alongside which, back then Adventure was very good with Aggron. Following that up is gonna be a universal, this is basically the tip of version 2 into the main push girlfriend, right? So very difficult choices to make. So if at any point of time from 2.0, which is Sparkle, 2.1, 2.2, 2.3, you ever lost a 50-50 or you went hard pity, you would have probably had to make some sacrifices, right? Like if things went wrong and you kind of just spend all of your pulls per version according to this caliber. But of course, assuming that if nothing terrible happens based on my personal planning, I most likely would have still put Aggron. Because when they revealed Aggron to have the overall technique to one-shot enemies, that would have made me like, oh my god, bro, that was essentially the equivalent of a global passive back then. But they haven't actually fully introduced a real global passive, but purely just for that one-shot overall, especially because back then SU was still like a pretty big thing where you want to like one-shot the mob and just get like the daily activities like a lot more manageable. Getting myself this Aggron alongside with her absolutely insane trailers, the Sasbian Lex, the power scaling level, and I pulled for Silverwolf. Right, I pulled for Silverwolf back in 1.1, so naturally, because of a reliance on 2 inhibited units, which is gonna be Silverwolf as well as Pella, I would then be able to make use of Aggron killing Scylla, and I will use this with Silverwolf, Pella, and Fusion. So naturally, I would say this is a very nice option for me as a player, and I would have gotten her signature weapon back then, whether or not they actually decide to give us Emblem in the future. So I will slap this on, bada boom, our first ever signature Lycone back in version 2. Alright, and I skipped Sparkle because you have S5 DDD, so okay, for this adventuring slot, right, I would say this will hold like more value to me as a player if I skip Fusion, or if I skip Huan Huan. But because I already put both Fu Xuan and Huan Huan, which means I have 2 limited sustains that I can use for Dale as well as Aggron. So Fu Xuan being preservation can also make use of trend on universal market for the burn. I would have personally skipped Aventry. Right? Not because it's bad, but at the same time, we are also introduced to Gallagher, at the exact same time frame. So if there are situations where either my Fu Xuan or Huiwen cannot sustain, then the Gallagher would have came as an emergency backup since we didn't really have anything to do with 3-team content for them, right? So that will be my first 2-cost investment upgrade in version 2 featuring E0S1 aggro, right? Then our next version is gonna be Bobbin into Boot Hill. Frankly speaking, from this standpoint, there was not really any situation where I will be tempted to pull for Boot Hill because I already know Firefly is coming. I have played the version 2 Panacity story quest. I have seen my girlfriend die, right, in-game. So the appeal for me to choose Boot Hill over Firefly, especially considering Bobbin was the very same version, it would not have been there. Which is also why I can see why Boot Hill sales was just like a really, really terrible timing between a very, very good support as well as basically the girlfriend of version 2, right? But that being said, Bobbin would have been an incredibly, incredibly good pull for me because I like, okay, once again, personally speaking, I do like pulling for supports. Especially the support is going to be able to buff majority of my DPS, right? If I were to pull for Bobbin in this very exact moment, I can definitely consider slotting either with Aggron if I went for an E2 Aggron, or I just slap bro back with DHPD for Sparkle and Bobbin, right? But as of this very moment, the reason why I wanted to pull for Bobbin is because I am not going to be pulling for Boot Hill, and frankly speaking, I would have not pulled for Firefly. Alright, it's not that I think Break is weak. In fact, Break is a very, very strong team that even till this day, Break is like, I believe Firefly is the only tier 0 DPS in private as of right now, right? Ever since the inclusion of Dahlia, from version 2 anyways. Yeah, she's the only version 2 tier 0. So once again, it is not with the foresight of seeing what is happening in the future, but I don't really like the way that Break is playing back then because I don't like being restricted to a toughness lock scenario. Before Dahlia was a thing anyways. So I rather want to have a little bit more consistency with like my attacks going DPS, which means if I'm going to be skipping Boot Hill and I'm going to be skipping Firefly, then Bobbin is going to be a relatively easy cost to invest. And I'm not sure how do I do this, but just as a mental note, I would have probably gotten my first ever Eidolon for that E1 Bobbin. So in version 2 so far, this is going to be 2 costs with 1/1, so that's gonna be 4 with our additional S1 into Aggron right here. I would not have went for Bobbin's signature because I believe back then we have 2 main options, which is either Poise to Bloom, or you could just temporarily slap on the Bronya Lycone. If you have access to a Bronya Lycone just for the energy regeneration, or worst come to first, if you really, really want to, you maybe can consider slapping on S1 Runmei, but at S1 is not too good for the energy portion, so not the best case now, right? So that is gonna be our E1 S0 Bobbin version 2. Then going forward, like I mentioned, I'm gonna be skipping Boot Hill, I'm gonna be skipping Firefly. There's no way in God's green who actually thought of pulling for Jade. I just don't really ever see like Jade being a temptation for me as an account. Like even on my main account, I believe Jade was the first ever unit I skipped on my main account, which at this point have pulled for every single unit, alright? So I just never really found the appeal of where or not I need Jade because the entire kit just screams revolving around pure fiction, and if you want to get yourself working in the MOC, you could potentially get an E1, but at this point I already have a Dale, and I have a Aggron, and if I really want to, I could run an easier Azure setup, right? So Jade just did not make a lot of sense for me back then, and that is gonna lead us straight into version, I believe, 2.4, with Yun Li as well as Jiao Qiu. Now, because I am knowing what Jiao Qiu is gonna be doing at this point, I am gonna be putting, right? Like, as much as you guys want to make fun of Jiao Qiu, right? What the fuck happened with Jiao Qiu? Bro fell off, bro can't do shit. Back then, on bro's release, his value to anyone with an Aggron was undisputed, right? Like, if you were an Aggron owner, you definitely would have gotten, or at least heavily considered Jiao Qiu, because your next best replacement, the amount of debuff stacking from essentially Pella was nowhere near what Jiao Qiu was able to provide. And especially if even you want to consider Silver Wolf, right? If you didn't have an E1 Silver Wolf, your ultimate uptime was also a little bit questionable. So you could even consider running Jiao Qiu alongside Pella to stack on your AoE defense down, and your aircon can deal way more damage. So for this one cost E0S0 slap on resolution, it would have been a very obvious choice for me as an aircon player to still get Jiao Qiu despite what happened going forward. Whether he gets Nova Flare, no Nova Flare, Cypher, Emblem, whatever the fuck it's gonna be, I would have gotten this one cost for Jiao Qiu, no questions asked, because I have aircon, right? So that's gonna be our 2.5 tier. Okay, this is gonna be my favorite time of all time in Honkai God Real, because for the first time in human history, they have announced the release of Fei Xiao, right? They finally announced the closest thing I can resemble to a muscle mommy, right? And like I mentioned, it is not purely with the perspective of chasing meta and all that kind of stuff, but when Fei Xiao came out at 2.5, I would have full committed for her E2S1. So this is going to be our first ever E2S1 unit. It is not even from a perspective of like whether is she better or is aircon better. I just really like Fei Xiao. So 4 cost investment straight out the get-go, and because I see how well Fei Xiao is gonna be working with Babin, this is also gonna be essentially my highest invested cost team from the start of version 1 all the way to version 2, because that will be our E1 Babin alongside with our E2S1 Fei Xiao. Obviously, I have made the decision to skip out on break, which means I am not going to be too concerned with Lingsha's placement here as well, since we already have ourselves, like I mentioned, Fu Xuan as well as Hui Hui, right? And if I really wanted to, there was Gallagher, which is also where I can see the entire discussion between whether Lingsha is better than Gallagher or is Gallagher better than Lingsha. Personally, for me, as of this very moment in the tier list, looking back in time, I would still not have considered Lingsha if I was a Firefly main, purely because Firefly back then, without Lingsha or with Lingsha, her performance was still quite okay. Especially for the real Firefly mains that even consider getting her E2. If you were to step on HMC, Firefly, Runmei, and Gallagher, your performance was like easily manageable. Sometimes even people consider getting for the sustainers run, right? So this Lingsha's pool value, because of Buckle's existence right here, this little guy, I would have really not considered Lingsha that much, unless I am someone that like the way Super Break plays, but I wasn't fully sold on Firefly and Boothill. So if I was like okay, you know, I like Runmei, I like HMC, but I don't really like Boothill and Firefly, I might have considered as a Lingsha main DPS, and I just get her right there to slap on Runmei, HMC, and then we're just waiting for one more on the future, right? So there will be a Lingsha placement, which I won't consider. Then 2.6 is gonna be, by the way, did you know that Sarah of the Lake's favorite version was 2.6? Yeah, Sarah said that Red Ball's 2.6 story was one of the greatest HSS story of all time, because apparently Sarah absolutely hated Penacony until 2.6 came out, which is just very interesting. But for 2.6, I would say it is a very easy decision for my account to skip as well, because I just finished pulling for E2S1 Fei Xiao, right? I'm not pulling for break whatsoever, and Red Ball was, you know, once again gonna be another break situation, so we're gonna skip. Which also reminds me, from this version on, we will no longer be getting a 4-star, right? So Mose is effectively the only 4-star that we are ever gonna see in God Real. You know, I'm just gonna put bro here, because even though he is not really like a 5-star, right? Because I went for the E2S1 Fei Xiao, and I know how well Mose is gonna work with Fei Xiao, I would have been really glad to just get that Mose and pair with my E2S1 Fei Xiao, right? So that is gonna be our 2.6, and that is gonna then bring into the final version being Sunday as well as Fuck You. I would say at this very particular point of time, Sunday would have been a decision for me to pull for anyways. From what I know in version 2 up until like maybe D-Hard and Eglair, I would have still pulled for Sunday. Main reason is really just because I wanted to see if there's a way that action value advancer for an account without Bronya, right? I'm just gonna assume that this account doesn't really have Bronya, but if I were able to make use of Sunday right here, then Sunday's action value advance can give me the additional energy regeneration. And back then, I also made a video on my main channel where I was not too happy with Sunday because I got like tricked, right? Because they released Sunday as a teaser that he's gonna work with Mimo's price. Do y'all remember? Like before they actually announced Enforcers, they were like, Sunday is gonna work with Mimo sprites. So a lot of players back then just assume, okay, you know what, if I put for Sunday right here, he is gonna be the perfect bridge between V2 to V3 because he is gonna be fitting into every single Mimo sprite team. Fast forward, bro just works with Aglia, and when Cassius came out, bro, I was like so fucking angry, bro. Like, how the hell is Sunday gonna be anti-synergy with Cassius, right? So I would have still went for Sunday in order to either prepare myself a little bit better for version 3, or simply just because I just kind of like pulling for these kind of like generalist, action value advanced, energy regeneration kind of supports. So that will bring our total cost in version 2 to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So this is gonna be a 11 cost investment in version 2, which is gonna be a little bit higher than version 1. But because our version 1 didn't commit the full full cost invested, since we were slightly under 10 cost, it would have been a little bit over, but just barely. If there was not enough cost for Sunday, because if average, let's just say we have like 10 cost per version, I would have probably skipped out Sunday, which would have been a blessing in disguise anyways, right? But version 2, I would say, because of the desire I had to chase for facial, because facial was just so cool, it made me a little bit greedy and stupid, because we technically went a little bit over budget. Right, so this V1 is going to be 8 cost, and then V2 is going to be 11 cost. Actually, as a matter of fact, now that I think about it, if after I chased E2 as on facial, and I didn't have enough pools to secure E0 as one Sunday, I might have considered skipping Sunday. Because we really didn't have like a very nice as... Okay, unless if I have like a Bronya Lycoon, I could potentially leave it there as like a temporary replacement. But Sunday without S1, his skill point generation was definitely a bit of an issue, right? But I would have been a little bit more skeptical, especially depending on how those E2 S1 facial pools actually went, right? So that will be my version 2 cost investment. That is gonna be 8 cost version 1 as well as 11 cost version 2 for a grand total of 19 costs across version 1 and version 2. Right, now we move on into version 3. Because we basically blew the bank, right? I will effectively be going into version 3. Let's just assume 0 cost, right? I would have 0 pools left going into version 3 because I basically blew everything on the facial for the E2 S1. That means I am forced, right? I cannot even pull for Herda because I literally have a 0, right? And by the time Aglia rolls around, even if I had 1 cost, I still would have went for it because I still have a very decent-ish E0 S1 aircon with Jiao as well as my E2 S1 wife. So because of these 2 DPSs, version 3.0 would not have been a pull for me. And after knowing what E1 3B is going to be doing by 3.1, this will be our first 2 costs. So we will backload our cost investment from version 3.0 into our first 2 costs at 3.1 for that E1 S0 3B. I don't think this is too much of an explanation. So E0 S1 3B or E1 S0 3B DM by the morning. My day, Castoris, Anaxa, Hyacinth. I'm just gonna lump them all up into the same category, which is as much as I would have liked to pull them, I simply cannot afford to invest that level of cost because I blew my load in version 2, right? And I think this is a very real scenario that you will face as a player as well. Because like for example, Bob, right? Bob only started in version 3. So he doesn't have the issue where like his early game cost, like your first time clear, first time login, first time exploration, you didn't spend those pools on Bob on version 1 and 2 units. So Bob had more leeway going to version 3 since his pools were completely backloaded. But if I was a day 1 player from version 1.0, I do not have the same luxury as Bob, which means going to version 3, I will need to be extremely like TS, right? I need to like allocate my cost way more because I do not have enough. So because of that, not that I hate Amphorius, but simply because I love facial, I do not have the luxury of investing into any of these DPS, right? Even the highest thing, which is like, oh my god, you know what, 80, why do I? Then for Cypher, because I'm in this camp where I heavily invested into E2 S1 Aggron as well, or E2 S1 facial, as well as Aggron, I would have unironically picked up this Cypher cost. Since I already skipped out every single main DPS version in version 3, back then, before Emblade, Cypher was a very slight damage upgrade to both Aircron and Facial. And at this point, I would have said that, okay, you know what? Cypher's damage value would have outpaced Silverwolf, which means my Aircron team back then would have been either a sustainless Aircron with either a Sparkle or a Bubbin. I guess it can't be Bubbin because Bubbin is going to be Facial. Or I would still stick with a sustain, stick with Fu Xuan, Jiao Qiu, Cypher, as well as Aircron for the E0 S1, because I didn't get an E2, right? So I think Cypher here would have definitely been my next one cost upgrade, still sticking on with the very, very timeless S5 resolution, because I don't really think we have too many costs to allocate for a Cypher S1. If I had enough costs to allocate for the Cypher S1, I would have honestly gotten that Cypher S1, because the additional speed as well as whatchamacall, the defense now, it would have been a very, very nice upgrade. So if I have the additional cost left, I would have gotten this, right? So, okay, let's just assume I got this, because if I had the means, I would have done it. Then moving on to the remaining versions of, yes, Mr. Kevin Castellana. So this was the exact same time that we would have invested either for Kevin Castellana or in preparation for what is to come from Evernight and Cyrene if you were a Mimo Stop enjoyer, right? So because of this particular instance, had I not chosen to invest in a E2 S1 facial, I would have full committed for the E2 S1 final. But because I went for the E2 S1 facial and my account is probably not going to be looking too healthy in terms of cost left, and considering I just got myself E0 S1 car, I unfortunately would have to skip the E2 S1 final. Because as good as this guy's E2 is going to be, it is still a very significant E2 S1. And at 3.4, we've gotten this 92.4 pulls alongside with the 103 and the 123. So grand total across 3.2, 3.3, 3.4, I would have gotten slightly under 300 pulls. And if I really got the E1 Triby into an E0 S1 car, I don't think I would have gotten anywhere near enough pulls to justify myself getting the additional E2 S1. So for those reasons, I am out. Then if I gotten the free archer, then there's just, free archer is free archer. So I'm just gonna put bro. Okay, you know, I'm not even gonna put bro here because it's free archer. And we have also gotten ourselves, I believe, the free DHPT, which is also the same moment where I feel got real is got real. Because from what this account is looking like, I desperately needed a sustain. Right? Because I have not pulled for a single sustain since Huanhui. And when Goril announced the free DHPD, I would have glazed Star Rail so fucking hard because it was exactly what this account needed, right? So very, very nice for the free DHPD, but unfortunately, I could not really invest in any of the 3.4 teams. And then because I skipped Vinon, I'm not going to think about Saridra, and Saridra is not going to do anything, so I'm going to skip all that. Skip DOT, skip Evernight, this is going to be free, so it is what it is. And I would also have essentially skipped Cyrene. So for this particular account that started off from 1.0, I think version 3 would have been the most difficult time of my life since I effectively skipped every single main DPS in version 3 because I decided to pull for my waifu, or I decided to go for the E2 S1, and I would try to make my version 2 teams work going into version 3, which I feel like is a very similar sentiment that my free-to-play account will have right now, which is I am skipping the version 4 elation, and I'm at a choice of do I go for additional upgrades to make my free-to-play version 3 remembrance team even stronger, or maybe a third team option for version 3 with my Herda, Anexa, and Mighty, or do I just go for a brand new version 4, which is gonna be Himeko Nova 4.4, right? Luckily for Bob, right? You know, like those like your parents, right? Like, back in my days, we had to suffer, bro. Like, this is like back in my days, right? If you were a 1.0 players, you really had to suffer because you didn't have the luxury of backloading your version 1 and version 2 pulls, right? But because Bob had the luxury to do that, he is going into the decision of where to pull for Himeko with, at this point, 600 limited pulls, right? Bob literally has 600 limited pulls. And at this point, my account right here will legit be like living paycheck to paycheck, even though both players are like completely free play. Alright, so that is gonna be our version 3 decision, whether or not I would have gotten myself the full 3-star clearing endgame content it will be completely questionable as to do I have enough vertical investments for either Acheron or Facial, which is why we are going to be trying to make our car as well as E1 Tribute work alongside with both of these units, right? So that is going to be our version 3 pooling plans for my free-to-play account. So we effectively only spend ourselves 1, 2, because E1 Tribute, and 3, 4 with car. That is going to be 4 cores grand total in version 3. So this is 8 plus 11 plus 4, which is, I believe, what is 8 plus 11 plus 4? 8 plus 11, 9, 23, right? So this is gonna be a 23 cost investment of version 3, and I would have most likely felt like, oh my god, HSR's power creep is too crazy because my version 2 teams don't have enough cost to keep up, right? But version 4 is where everything changes. Because when I go into version 4, after saving up and recovering from my lack of units in version 2, and when they announced the inclusion of units like Asheville as well as Alright, I completely forgot about Dahlia, which we're going to be skipping anyway, so it is what it is. When they announced the inclusion of Asheville as well as M-Blade, those two would have been my logical next step upgrade to get myself the 2 cost investment to make both my Acheron as well as Facial stronger. If I have enough at this point to either go for an Ash 1 Asheville, or if I have the means to save up all the way to get E2 Blade, I would have committed for this. Just to make both Acheron and Facial as strong as humanly possible. If I do not have enough cost, then this tool is still gonna be my next choice, because till this day, I am still running a Fu Xuan Huan DHPT. So my sustain might be a little bit cooked, depending how they would actually go about the version 4 sustain. Because my only version 3 sustain is basically the free DHPT, which is still gonna work very, very well with, I would say, either Acheron or Facial. But the one that's gonna be using Huan is gonna be a little bit scary. But we'll just see how that version 4 sustain is going to be, right? So I think at this point, that will pretty much wrap up my... How many is this? This is 4, right? And this is gonna be 2. Just barely 25-ish cost total team. 25 out of 28. So I have 3 costs left over from every single version that would have gone as a free-to-play. So I would either use that to get myself plus 3 more for E2 Blade, or just go on myself the E0 S1 Asheville, and then we'll see how the future plan is gonna be going forward. I would say from version 4, I would most likely have a much easier time, considering it is like a cyclical upgrade, since version 3 we kind of like homeless, right? We were essentially facing huge difficulties in version 3 trying to clear, but because there's a free play and we're not going to be swiping, I cannot really have the additional cost to make sure I commit myself for the 3-star endgame content, right? So I think this is pretty much gonna be how this team is looking like. Oh my god, you know what? Assuming that we have enough for Archer here, right? Because third team endgame was around 3.4, which is Final Castellana, right? Assuming we were able to let go of this Archer, which is gonna combine with Spargo, and we have the announcement of Rinto Saga, as well as the free E1 Archer, I would most likely be getting this in version 4 as well. So I don't even think I would have enough for E2 Blade, because I do want to make sure my third team, which is gonna make use of the E0 into E1 Archer, is gonna be strong enough such that I can clear my 3 different endgame content, right? So that will be my personal pooling decisions of everything I would have invested in Honkai Starbucks, a grand total of roughly 28, 26, 27 out of 28 costs from every single pool that you would have gotten in version, I would say, 1 all the way through to version 3. Let me know what your pooling decision is gonna be like in the comments down below. Once again, it is nowhere near the best investment choice at every possible way, because if you really wanted to play HSR with the lowest cost possible, it is essentially 8 costs per version. You invest to a flagship. So if I were to redo everything just purely from the sake of like low cost meta clears, I get a Firefly, I get a Caceres, I get an Elation. And then that will pretty much be that, right? So word of the day is going to be Rin. Join Discord, use code BOGI for 10% off gamer subs. All the best for your gacha pools, and I will see you tomorrow. Thank you.